Caution: this podcast contains adult language, sexual themes, and depictions of violence that some may find triggering. This podcast and its hosts are not responsible for the accuracy of the material presented, as it is strictly based on our own limited research and personal opinions. The information presented is not to be confused with actual investigative files pertaining to the cases or official court and/or law enforcement records and transcripts.
Ricky Lake, Montel Williams, Rolanda, Sally Jesse Raphael, Donahue, Geraldo, Jerry Springer, Jenny Jones, Maury Povich, before he was a mononym. If you can recognize 3 to 4 of those names, it is probably time for a retinol cream and maybe a little Botox. If you're of a certain age, then you could probably remember when trash talk shows reigned supreme and they dominated the world of daytime television in America. Now, today's episode revolves around a murder that stemmed from an unaired episode of The Jenny Jones Show back in March of 1995. So, buckle the fuck up. Let's hop in this DeLorean because we're going back to the 90s and shit is about to get real. All right, guys, so picture it. It's March of 1995. Sybil, the Wayans brothers, and Goosebumps are in the top ranks of popular sitcoms. And the top song on the music charts is the timeless turn-up anthem, "This Is How We Do It" by Montel Jordan. Now, while the music industry was popping the fuck off, so was the world of daytime television with the phenomena of wild-ass talk shows. Now, I remember going home on sick days and watching this shit with my mom. We loved Ricky Lake because they used to be like, "Go Ricky, go Ricky, go Ricky." Back in those days, before people had the ability to judge the shit out of other people on social media, we heavily depended on trashy daytime talk shows. Like, that's how else were we supposed to judge people? I mean, think about it. We use Instagram and TikTok, and we even have good old ratchet Facebook to peek into the trashy-ass lives of everyday people. Back in the 90s, you didn't have that shit, so you could only really do this via the daytime talk show lineup. That's how you were able to kind of look into other people's lives and, not feel so bad about yours. Now, these shows were all about shock value, 3,000%. The messy-ass hosts and their even messier producers would solicit and bring on these fucking people whose lives were a goddamn hot-ass mess. And they would honestly just exploit the fuck out of them for ratings. Now, people absolutely loved going on these shows and confessing like scandalous sins or like secret crushes. You would see everything from fucking like the Ku Klux Klan would be on there fighting with black people. There would be paternity tests. And then one of the most popular topics, which is the subject of today's episode, the romantic confessions. So, I want to start this episode off by telling you a little bit about the victim whose vicious murder lies at the center of today's show. So, Scott Bernard Amedure was born on January 26, 1963 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, he was an Aquarius. I don't really know shit about Aquariuses, but according to everyone who knew Scott, he was a great guy, he was super likable. Ironically enough, his brother would later tell interviewers that Scott loved being in the limelight and always wanted to be on TV and wanted to be famous, which makes it extra fucked up that he did fulfill that, dream of wanting to be famous, but it was only because of this fucking case. So, Scott had been in the military, and before he left the military, he actually came out to his family. And they took it really well. Like, they were Gucci. They were like, okay, next, what else? You're gay? Cool. No big deal. So we have Scott. He's openly gay. And in 1995, he's 32 years old. He's this cool-ass guy who's, living his best, low-key ginger life in Lake Orion in Michigan. I guess that's the city, Lake Orion, Michigan, or the town, or whatever the fuck. So he had this homegirl named Donna, and she lived in the same apartment complex as his older brother. And she was totally Scott's fruit fly. She was, they would kiki, whatever, go out together like they were just homies. Well, one day he goes over to her apartment because she was having problems with the brakes on her car. And he sees this guy is like working on the car. And when the guy rolls out from underneath, it's like this hot neighbor. And the guy's all like greased up and shit. So, of course, in true homosexual fashion, Scott tells Donna, he's like, damn, bitch, like, what the fuck? Like, you have this fine ass, snack ass neighbor, and you wasn't gonna tell me? Like, wow, like, what a friend. So she introduces him, and Scott meets this 25-year-old guy whose name is Jonathan Schmitz. So time goes on, and Scott was at home one night. One day watching his favorite show, Jenny Jones. Like he was a stan. So at the end of the show, she does this little altar call to action thing. Except this time when Scott watched it, he felt like she was talking directly to him. So Jenny's like, "Do you have a same-sex crush and want to confess it to that person on the show? Call us now." So God rest his soul, and I don't mean to disrespect the dead, but Scott decided to be messy boots and calls. And so he and Donna, they hatched this plan to get Jonathan on the show and drop this fucking bomb on him, like literally ambushing him on national television with this confession. I mean, what could go wrong, right? Well, now I need to tell you a little bit about this guy, Jonathan, just so you can have some context here. So Jonathan is this straight guy who was raised in an allegedly abusive, homophobic household. Jonathan also suffered from manic depression and Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disease. He also had several suicide attempts in his past. And now he had been with this girl for a really long time, and he was engaged to her, but the engagement had been broken off. So Jonathan is just living his life. He truly has no fucking idea about what's going to happen. He has no clue that his neighbor and homegirl, Donna, is putting together this plan with her gay bestie. Like, at all. He's completely clueless. So he gets a call one day from the Jenny Jones show stating that he's been identified as a person who someone has a crush on. Now, apparently, he asked if the person was a woman, and the producer on the phone told him it could be a man or a woman. So Jonathan told him, was like, if it's a guy, like, if it's a guy, or if there's anything fucking weird or crazy, like, I don't want any part of it. So the producer chick, apparently, she was just like, it could be a man or a woman. And so he started to get a little freaked out. Like, Jonathan's just like, and she's like, it'll be fine, don't worry. So Jonathan agrees to go on the show. And this is where, this is just sad. So he goes out, he buys this like expensive ass outfit. 'Cause he's like, bitch, I gotta get fly, I'm gonna be on TV. And he tells his coworkers, he's like, yo, I'm going on Jenny Jones because someone has a crush on me. And he tells them that he's like basically sure it's like his ex. He's like, it's my ex, she wants me back. So he had this plan of when his ex-girlfriend, comes out on the Jenny Jones show, he was gonna propose to her on the spot. So he is so excited. This kid hops on a plane, he goes to Chicago, and he heads to the studio where the Jenny Jones show was recorded at this Warner Brothers studio. Okay. All right. Now, I want to give a couple fun facts about Jenny Jones, and this is mainly for the people who maybe have never heard of her before. Maybe you're a little bit younger. I was a kid in the '90s, so I watched Jenny Jones after school or the days I didn't go to school or got out early, whatever. So Jenny Jones was this super successful. At this time, she was 49 years old. She's a Canadian American talk show host. But before that, she apparently was a drummer in a rock band and a backup singer. And she was a fucking stand-up comedian, which is kind of wild because I don't ever remember her being funny. But I guess when she started this show, originally, she wanted to be like Oprah Winfrey. So she wanted a show like the Oprah Winfrey Show. But she quickly realized that trash TV was selling like hotcakes. So she pivoted her brand and she went the Jerry Springer, Ricky Lake route. So just to give you an idea of what her show is like and who she is. All right, so now we're going to talk about the build-up to the actual recording of this show on March 6, 1995. Now, according to Donna, the fruit fly, Scott's homegirl, Scott and Jonathan's homegirl, the Jenny Jones show producers encouraged her and Scott to have some drinks before the show to loosen them up and get rid of any nerves, aka lower their inhibitions so that they can get up there and make an ass of themselves and increase the show's ratings. Let's be real. So the producers went so far as to pay for a bar tab at the hotel bar where they stayed. So they had like a stipend for alcohol. Additionally, once they arrived at the studio, the green room allegedly had a bottle of vodka. And I guess Scott, when he showed up, he was drinking a beer and they were like, come on in. Like they were just loving it. Well, the show starts with a fucking bang. So the producers had instructed Scott to make it good and juicy, otherwise Jenny Jones would be fucking mad. And apparently, they also told him to give Jonathan flowers, which he refused to do. It's like, when Jonathan comes out, you should give him flowers. And he was just like, no. And they also suggested that he try to kiss Jonathan, which he was just like, no, like, I don't want to do all that. So you have on the stage Donna and you have Scott. So when Jenny, the show begins and Jenny starts with her opening remarks, she's trying to get the audience riled up and she's trying to like fluff them, for what they're about to see. So here's what her opening remarks were verbatim. She said, now, which one of these ways would you choose to reveal your secret crush on someone? She goes, would you A, write that person a letter? Or would you B, tell the person in private just in case he rejects you? She goes, or would you C, tell that person you're gay and you hope he is too on national television in front of millions of people? And the crowd fucking erupts in like laughter and screaming. They're like, woo, woo, woo. Like they're just eating this shit up. So you have Donna and Scott on stage, and Jonathan is backstage with these like noise cancellation headphones on or whatever. And then Jenny introduces them, and she starts off by asking them some questions. So she asked about the first time that Scott met Jonathan. And she's like, what was your first impression? She's like, tell us about this crush or whatever. So he tells a story about him being under the car. So then messy ass Jenny asked Scott a question that the producers had clearly fed to her based on an like off camera discussion and that Scott had. And she's like, do you have any fantasies about him? And Scott is like nervous and he's like, yeah. So then, of course, messy ass Jenny goes, well, what's your specific fantasy? She literally said that. And Scott's like, well, yeah, I've had a couple, or whatever. And she's like, no, you had a fantasy about him when he was under that car working on Donna's brakes, didn't you? And Scott is like, yeah, it was something about the brake line oil or something. And so he's trying to keep it vague. But old Jenny is like probing. And she's like, you had another fantasy involving a hammock. Tell us about that fantasy. And so he's super apprehensive and he actually pauses. Like Scott pauses for a second. And then he's like, yeah, I had a fantasy about, I have a big hammock in my backyard and I had a fantasy about tying him up to my hammock. And of course, everyone's like, what? And then Jenny's like, of course, she goes, and? Which I'm like, bitch, really? I mean, first of all, a fantasy about tying somebody up to a fucking hammock is very fucking weird. But then he stops there. But then Jenny's like, and? And he goes, well, it involved like, tying him up and like whipped cream and champagne. So then everyone in the audience is like screaming, like, ah, bitch, wow, that's so crazy. So then messy ass Jenny just fucking spoon in the pot, stirring that shit. She asked Scott, she's like, so what's so exciting to you about him? And Scott is like, he's got this cute little hard body, and the ones where you just want to pick him up and put him in your cabinet and, dust him off every once in a while. So everyone is screaming, they're loving it. And you can kind of tell that, like, Scott was nervous, but, like, the audience is, like, gassing him up, and, like, there's this crazy energy. So he's probably going off of adrenaline and, like, okay, they're responding well to this. So then messy Jenny's like, oh my God, you want to physically pick him up? And Scott's like, oh, he's just so little tiny and cute and he's just gorgeous. So then Jenny says to Scott, she goes, he knows you're gay, right? And Scott's like, yes. And then Jenny asks Donna, she goes, do you know if Jonathan's gay? And Donna's like, no. And then Scott's like, anything is possible. And then of course the audience like, ah, ka, ka, ka. So then Jenny asks Donna, she said, do you have any reason to think that he is gay? And this is where fucking Donna gets real goddamn messy. And this is where she kind of lost me in, like, the respect department. Like, I was just this wasn't cute. So then Donna goes, not really. Like, I don't have any reason to think he is. She goes, but he did say that his family kind of questioned him about it. Which, I mean, this is just so fucked up because she knows this is going on national television. And she's airing this man's dirty laundry out there. And this is probably something that did I say dirty laundry? Is that what I said? I don't know. Anyway, she's airing this man's shit out there on national TV, and this is probably something that he told her in confidence, about his parents, and I'm sure, like, that conversation alluded to them being homophobic. Like, he's like, my parents asked me if I was gay or questioned me about my sexuality, and I'm like, if he told you this, why are you telling this on TV? Anyways, like, God rest his soul, Scott, and I don't know if Donna's alive still, but they're literally trying to get their 5 minutes of fame at the expense of this unknowing guy who's like 7 years younger than them, who they've like super hypersexualized. And I digress. It just stressed me out, this whole exchange. Like, but even before Jonathan got on the stage, like, it's the 90s, I know, but between Jenny and between Donna, and then now, Scott is, feeling his oats. So he's like, kind of like, making these jokes or whatever and these innuendos. It's just a lot. So this is when Jenny's like, okay, well, let's see if he is gay, basically. Take the headphones off Jonathan and bring him out so we could find out who his crush is. So they bring Jonathan out, and there's this awkward ass moment. He hugs Donna, and then he goes in for a handshake for Scott, and he extends his hand, but Scott pulls him into a hug. And you could tell that Jonathan's kind of like trying to pull away a little bit, like it's super fucking awkward. So of course, the only open chair they brought out is next to Scott. So Jenny, and this is where Jenny like lost it for me. Like I was like, done, I can't with you. Jenny said, she goes, okay, Jonathan, did you think that Donna had a crush on you? And and Jonathan's trying to respond to her, and he's like, well, and she literally cuts him off and goes, it's Scott's the crush. And then the audience starts roaring with like laughter and screaming, and like Jonathan is laughing too, but it's like nervously laughing. And then he looks over at Donna and Scott, and he's like, oh my god, he's like, you guys lied to me, which I'm assuming he means they lied about what they had planned for the weekend. They didn't tell him they were coming on the show. So Jenny is like trying to milk this obviously uncomfortable moment, and she's just exploiting the situation. So Jenny asks Jonathan, "Did you have any idea he liked you this much?" And he told her, he goes, "Well, Donna had told me that Scott thought I was cute, and I was like, that's cool, but I'm straight." And that's what really pisses me off. Is like Donna told him like, hey, Scott has a crush on you, and he said, that's cool, but I'm straight. And they still did this whole fucking ruse and like brought him on the show. So this is where it just continues to get off the rails messy. So messy ass Jenny is like talking to Jonathan. She's like, oh, well, he's been fantasizing about you since he saw you working under that car. So she's like spilling this tea, laying it on thick, and like Jonathan is like smiling excessively, trying to be cool. And then this is when Jenny's like, all right, guys, we're going to play back that clip on this little monitor here of what Scott said about you. Which there was a monitor in front of Jonathan, and they play back the clip of Scott talking about the whipped cream. Like they find the most salacious part of what was said before he came out, and it's the whipped cream comments. And Jonathan's like covering his face, and he's just wearing this huge smile, trying to like I can't imagine like just being that caught off guard. And mind you, he came on this show with the expectation in the back of his mind. He just thought he was gonna see like it's gonna be my fiance, my ex-fiance, like we're gonna get back together. But instead it's this gay guy, and he is just stressed. So Jenny asks him if he's single, and he's like, yes, I'm single, but I'm definitely a heterosexual. So throughout this whole encounter, I honestly would say Jonathan was a great sport about it. Like you could tell it's uncomfortable, but he's smiling, he's eating it, he's just like, it is what it is. And of course, to make an awkward moment even more awkward, old Jenny, she's like, so are you disappointed, Scott? And he gives a nice answer, and then the segment ends. So apparently, after the taping, Scott, Donna, and Jonathan all flew back to Michigan together, and then they all went out for a night of drinking and dancing. So everybody was cool. Like, Jonathan was cool. Um, and when they got back, I guess when they were all hanging out, they all found this like broken yellow light in a parking lot, and then Scott teased Jonathan and said it could be his new blinker because the blinker on Jonathan's car was broken. They laughed it off, they drank, they turned up, everyone had a good time. Well, this is when, I believe the next day, Jonathan calls his homophobic father to tell him that he's back in Michigan, and he tells him that things didn't go as planned with the show. And I think he wanted to kind of prep his family for what they were about to see on national fucking television, his homophobic family. I think Jonathan wanted to prep them. And I guess his dad went the fuck off and was like cursing at him about it and talking about fags and like threw a chair apparently. Like he was really pissed. And the dad actually testified that this happened later on in the trial. So at this point, we've moved into another day. It's 3 days after the recording of the show. Jonathan has been spiraling. He's high-key freaking out about the show that's going to air and how his family's going to react, how people are going to react, how people are going to look at him, his friends. Like, it's the 90s. People were hella fucking problematic, hella fucking homophobic, and toxic masculinity was king. So Jonathan is trying to come to terms with, like, what the fuck just happened to him and the fact that it's actually going to be airing on national TV soon. And I'm sorry, but I feel like that's fucking traumatic for him. Like, that would be a lot, especially for someone who's battling their own demons, was raised in the type of home he was raised in, and like has all these mental health issues that he's dealing with. So, like I said, it's been 3 days since the recording, and he had been on this bender of like just smoking and just trying to cope with shit. So he's out and he comes home and he finds a suggestive ass, like, handwritten note on his door. And it said, "If you really want to get it off, I've got the right tool." So right away, he assumes this is from Scott. He knows. And so this is when he completely snaps, like fucking snaps, off the rails, done. He immediately goes to the bank, like, did not pass go, did not collect $200, went straight to the fucking bank, takes cash out, and then he drives to a gun store to purchase ammunition and a fucking shotgun. He literally hops in the car from that place, loads the gun, hops in his car, and drives directly to Scott's mobile home. So he walks up to the door with the note in hand, and Scott answers the door, and the first thing Jonathan says is, "Scott, did you write this note?" And Scott didn't give him an answer. I guess he just smiled. So then Jonathan walks away without saying a word and goes back to his car. I'm sure Scott just assumed Jonathan was leaving. And this is when Jonathan grabs the shotgun out of his car and goes back to Scott's front door. Scott sees the gun and tries to slam the door shut, but Jonathan wedges the barrel of the gun into the door. So this is when Scott screams to his friend Gary, who was visiting, and is like, "Help, Gary, he's got a gun." But it's too fucking late. The door won't close because the gun is wedged in it, and Jonathan forces his way in. This is when Scott throws one of his wicker chairs at Jonathan to keep him away, and Jonathan shoots Scott in the chest twice. According to the witness, his friend Gary, there was literal smoke coming off of Scott's body. Well, Jonathan fled. He speeds away in his car, and he drives until he gets to a gas station, and this is where he stops and runs to a payphone and dials 911. Now, in the 911 recording, you can hear Jonathan, and initially he sounds super calm, and he's like, "I think I just shot a man." And the dispatcher's like, "Okay, I need you to remain calm and repeat yourself." And that's when he starts to lose it, and you can hear his voice, everything changes, and he's like panicking. And he's like, "I shot this guy, but I'm turning myself in." And she's like, "Why did you shoot him?" And he's like, "He played a really bad fucking thing on me and took me on the Jenny Jones show." And the rest is fucking history. Now, mind you, the episode had not aired yet, but we only have access to this footage because it was used in the trial, and the trial was broadcasted on court TV, so then, the footage exists, and it's out there. So immediately following the murder, like within days, between when the murder happened and Jonathan had been arrested, the Jenny Jones show was quick as fuck to put out a statement in the form of a recorded tidbit at the end of one of her shows. And in this recording, she's like, "As much as we regret what happened, the fact is that this tragedy is about the actions of one individual." So it was basically her and her show and Warner Brothers being like, "We're denying any fucking culpability, we're not accepting any fault in the aftermath of what happened after that recording. Like, bitch, don't even try us. Like, we're sad it happened." She called it a tragedy, but she's like, "This tragedy is about the actions of one individual." She was like, "We didn't do it." All right, so you have to keep in mind that this is the 1990s, and courtrooms were a fucking shit show, and America loved watching that fucking dumpster fire. The O.J. Simpson trial was in 1995, and this case went to trial in 1996, and it's about a major talk show, so everybody is tuning the fuck in. So Jonathan's defense at this trial, they said this in either their opening or closing arguments, that there was a shooting, but there was no murder, which, wild. So this trial is an absolute media circus. It is a hot fucking mess. In the trial, the defense, they were adamant about discussing, Jonathan's poor mental health, his abusive father, and they mentioned that he had multiple suicide attempts. They also talked about, Graves' disease, that he had, and how that causes hyperthyroidism, which has effects on the brain and cognitive functioning. So their entire defense was based around his mental health, and they leaned into an actual real life defense called the gay panic defense. Now, but I had to research this shit because I was shook. I'm like, no way. By the way, this is actually still a real thing in some states. So, by definition, the gay panic defense or homosexual advance defense is a legal strategy in which a defendant claims to have acted in a state of violence, temporary insanity, committing assault or murder because of an unwanted same sex sexual advance, usually between men. A defendant may allege to have found the same sex sexual advances so offensive or frightening that they were provoked into reacting, or acting in self defense, were of diminished capacity, or were temporarily insane, and that this circumstance is exculpatory or mitigating. So, there's also a trans panic defense as well, by the way. Now, the gay panic defense is typically used just to strengthen a traditional criminal law defense. And while using the gay panic defense to explain insanity has typically not resulted in like successful like winning of cases or a complete acquittal, diminished capacity and provocation and self-defense because of this have been used to successfully reduce charges and sentences. So they argued that when Scott hugged Jonathan, he felt trapped, and they said Scott pushed him over the edge and triggered the murder. And then they also said that when Scott threw the chair at Jonathan, when Jonathan came in with the gun, he caused him to snap and basically was asking to be killed. The defense attorney basically said that Scott should have apologized to him when he came over instead of throwing the chair, which, wow. So Jonathan was he was initially charged with first degree premeditated murder, which would bring a sentence of about 50 years in prison. But on December 5th, 1996, the jury deliberated and ultimately overturned the charge, and he was convicted of second degree murder, which is typically murder with malicious intent but not premeditated. Second degree murder also comes with a significantly lower sentence. Jonathan was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Now, when members of the jury did these interviews later, they talked about how much they loved Jonathan. One bitch was also like, she was like, I would love to have him as my son. They all felt really bad for him and considered him to be the victim in this. Scott's own brother even agrees that to an extent, Jonathan was a victim as well. Now, the conviction was subsequently overturned, but after a retrial, Jonathan was reconvicted of the same crime in 1999. Well, this is where the plot gets thicker than a snicker. So, Jonathan's family and Scott's family and the prosecutors, there was one thing that they all agreed on, and that was that the Jenny Jones Show and Warner Brothers, which was the Jenny Jones Show's parent company, shared some responsibility in what happened, and that some of Scott's blood was on their hands as well. So, in 1999, the civil suits brought on by the families entered the group chat. So they sued the Jenny Jones Show, Telepictures, and Warner Brothers for their ambush tactics and negligent actions that resulted in Scott's murder. They sued for a total of around $50 million. Now, this case was fucking groundbreaking because here we have these families that are effectively trying to take down the daytime talk show industry, which has just been the wild, wild west. So it was big because of that, but it was also big because not only did the show's producers get subpoenaed to testify, but so did Jenny Jones herself. Now, over 475,000 people viewed the trial daily on Court TV channel. And what's really fucked up, you want to know what's fucked up? Even while being sued, Warner Brothers still made a killing because guess what? They owned the Court TV channel. Fucking wild. So Scott's family got this big shot, flamboyant, over-the-top, showboating, attention-loving attorney named Jeffrey Feger. Now, Feger was already notorious for his unorthodox approach. He also shot to fame by representing Dr. Kevorkian, who was that doctor who gained international attention through his assistance in the suicides of more than 100 patients, some of whom were terminally ill. So needless to say, this wasn't Jeffrey's first time in the ring, and he jumped at the opportunity to pursue such a high-profile case. Scott's brother, when he called him, I guess Jeffrey was like, "Took you long enough." So he was known for taking on these big cases, even if he knew he would lose, just because it would keep his name in people's mouths. So, to give you an idea of how fucking extra this goddamn attorney was, his opening statement for this case was 2.5 hours long. Wild. So we have these lawyers, and they are ripping the fuck into Jenny Jones's producers, and the producers were so fucking smug. And there was one clip I saw, and it's where the attorney is really going in on this girl who was a producer, and who was the one who talked to Jonathan on the phone, the one who was like, "Your crush could be a guy or a girl," that girl. So they were basically like, "Bitch, you misled Jonathan and lied to him on the phone." And the chick is like, skirt? No, I didn't lie." And the lawyer was like, "Okay, well, could his crush have been a woman?" And she's like, "No, it was a guy." And he's like, "Well, bitch, like, that's literally a lie. You told him that it could be a man or a woman. So that's a fucking lie." So people that were watching this were really siding with the families. And they were looking at these producers like, "You guys are fucking demons." So the trial was really intense. And at one point during their testimonies, two of the producers dropped a fucking bomb. And this bomb was a fact that couldn't be substantiated, but its existence alone really threatened the family's argument that the show caused the murder. They testified that after the taping, they spoke with Scott and he told them how after the show, him, Jonathan, and Donna all went out, partied together, got drunk, then they went back to Donna's apartment and Jonathan and Scott hooked up. Bitch. I know. Now, Donna actually denied that this happened. So, for me, looking at it objectively, it would totally fuck up their argument, the family's arguments, and it would totally work in favor of the show's defense if this really happened. Because then they could be like, "Well, this was just like a lover's quarrel. It had nothing to do with us. They hooked up after the show." So I believe that both sides had reasons to lie about this allegation. So for me, I just kind of tossed it out of the equation altogether because I just feel like everybody had something to gain or lose or whatever from this being a fact or not being a fact. So I don't really know how to feel. I wasn't there. I don't know. Now, Jeffrey's line of questioning, the lawyer, Jeffrey, his line of questioning was fucking wild. Like, he was asking questions that were all objectable. Like, they were like, objection, objection, objection. But he was strategic because they were basically statements that he was introducing to to everyone that is watching and listening to cast doubt and to get his point across. So, in the form of a question. He was basically testifying through his line of questioning, but putting a question mark at the end of everything he said. Now, the real good part came when they brought Jenny in for questioning. Now, Jenny's fucking good. Like, her lawyers have prepped the fuck out of her, but also she is a media personality and does interviews for a living, so of course she's going to be good. So they tell her that if she hadn't been, trying to pull emotions out of Scott and Jonathan and probing with her questions and leading them with her these invasive ass, line of questioning, that the murder never would have happened. And she's like, "Our show is a lighthearted show. Like, we would never have expected this." So then they're like, if someone brought you on a show and was telling you how they would want to tie you up to a hammock and lick whipped cream off of you, you'd be embarrassed, right? And Jenny's like, "No, it could be exciting." And when she says this, people in the court start laughing and she's smirking. She's prepped. Like, this bitch is playing chess and it's making for great TV. She's smug, she's relaxed, she's calm, she's smiling. And the conversation, like the questioning, it's like tennis back and forth. She is ready for whatever they're serving to her. So this is when Jeffrey, being the hell of a lawyer that he is, like him or not, he said this is when he began to study her. Well, the next day or so, they bring her in for questioning and they put Jenny on the stand, and he is ready for her ass. Jeffrey, the lawyer, ready for her. So she sits down and he's like, "Hi, Miss Jones," or whatever, "how are you?" And she's like, "I'm well." And he goes, "Great." And he goes, "You're smiling. Did you realize that?" And she's like, "Yes, I believe I'm smiling, but so are you." And then Jeffrey's like, "You're not smiling because you're nervous, are you?" And she goes, "I'm not comfortable." And he goes, "So you smile when you're nervous or uncomfortable, don't you?" And she's like, "Sometimes." And he goes, "Well, that's exactly what Jonathan Schmitz did, didn't he? That's why he was smiling on on your show. It wasn't because he was so comfortable." Because her argument was that he was smiling, he was fine. We had no idea, like we had no way of realizing anything crazy would happen. He was smiling, he was fine. And now here comes the attorney dropping this mic because he's like, well, bitch, you're smiling when you're nervous, aren't you? And she's like, yeah. She's like, and that's exactly what Jonathan was doing because he was nervous. Like this his cross with her was really impressive. All her smug shit was gone after this. The laughing was gone. He had knocked her off of her game. And at this point, he's just like, bitch, you were the one that asked Scott to describe his sexual fantasy. And she's like stuttering and she's like, well, and he's like, nah, bitch, answer the direct question. And she's like, okay, yes. And then he's like, do me a favor. Show me a document where you had Jonathan sign and give you permission to have a man describe his sexual fantasies about him on your show. And she's like, well, we didn't ask for permission for that. And he's like, I know, bitch. Boom. So he made her look so bad. He made the show look bad, the producers look bad. And he was like, you used Jonathan for a source of entertainment without knowing what his reactions would be. And you opened this Pandora's box. So after all the testimonies, there were two questions that the jury had to decide on. One, was the defendant negligent, the show, were they negligent? And two, was their negligence what led to the injuries or damage to the plaintiff, aka the murder? Well, the jury found that the Jenny Jones show was both irresponsible and negligent, contending that the show intentionally created an unpredictable situation without due concern for the possible consequences. Now, Time Warner's defense attorney later claimed that the verdict would cause a chilling effect on the industry, and 8 out of 9 of the jurors felt so strongly, like they were like, yo, this bitch is fucking liable. This show is liable. Well, 3 years later, Warner Brothers challenged the ruling, and the judgment was overturned by the Michigan Court of Appeals in a 2-1 decision. The Michigan Supreme Court declined to hear the case altogether. Warner Brothers attorneys argued that the case never should have gone to trial in the first place, and that they were in no shape or form responsible for the shit that went down after the show. So, they got off. And what's really fucked up is that Warner Brothers never offered a settlement, even to the family. Even before the trial, after the trial, they never offered anything. Jenny Jones, she was never apologetic or remorseful. And Scott's family, they never received a dime, no type of financial award, a reward rather. $35 million was what was on the table for them, and it literally just disappeared in an instance. So, in the Netflix documentary series Trial by Media, they do an episode about this case. And Scott's brother talks about how he had to pay out of pocket, he had to pay a company to pick up Scott's trailer, which was all fucked up from the shooting, which is just so sad. Now, the Jenny Jones show was never the same after this. Their ratings plummeted, and as we move towards the end of this wild talk show era, hers was one of the first that people were just like, we're over it. Now, the show was officially canceled in 2003. It had dragged on for years. I don't know how it stayed on, but it was officially canceled in 2003. And crazy fact, Jonathan was actually released from prison in 2017 after serving 22 years, which is wild. Now, this case has so many fucking layers. It's like a goddamn trident. And it's really hard to point a finger in one direction, to be honest. I do think that if Scott hadn't been gay, that they definitely would have given Jonathan a tougher sentence. Some people think that 22 years was already a tough sentence when you consider all of the factors. Now, I also feel like Jonathan was a victim in all of this too. I just feel like it was a mess. I understand the anger towards Jonathan for murdering Scott, because being embarrassed and humiliated on television doesn't mean that you are justified in going out and murdering people. But I also understand the anger towards Scott and Donna for setting up this shit show of an ambush, knowing that he was straight. Or if they felt like he was straight, but he's in the closet, like bringing him on TV is not going to be the way to bring him out. And so I understand that side of it too. I also understand, and I personally feel disgusted by the Jenny Jones and the Jenny Jones show and their producers. But I mean, it was the 90s, and the 90s was a weird, fucking wild time. It was very, like I said, Wild Wild West, Outback Steakhouse, no rules, just right. So, yeah, guys, today's show, it's wild. This episode is, I have so many feelings. Whenever I do my sit down with a friend and we talk through the episode soon. I know we're going to do a recap soon enough of another set of like 2 or 3 episodes. I do want to talk about this with someone, so we're going to have that moment. It will come. But guys, I want to thank you for listening to the show. I want to thank you for continually supporting me and giving me great feedback. Shout out to my friend Keith, who used the question, the Q&A button on Spotify. I got my first question in, or response to the question, which was super cool. Actually, I need to find that question and I can read it to you. But guys, I want to thank you for tuning in. I want to encourage you to answer those questions. If you are a Spotify listener, you can find the listeners in the bottom, or the questions in the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and put some descriptions there as well. I'm going to read this question that was answered. I asked, what did you think about the episode? And we got a response. And he said, this is some fascinating shit. The drama behind Chinese history, mouth dropped. I'm impressed by your ability to break down side chicks, jealousy, and big dicks in such a complicated story. So thanks, Keith, for the shout out, guys. I would love to hear from you. You can rate and review the show. You can also answer these questions. You can follow me on Instagram at Bitch I Can't Pod. It's so funny. Every time I go to say that, I blank and I have no idea what the fucking Instagram handle is. At Bitch I Can't Pod. I'll be posting clips of these interviews and stuff, and of the actual show, the Jenny Jones show. I'm gonna be posting that shit because that's what I use the Instagram for primarily, is really just giving you guys these little nuggets of behind the scenes stuff and little, I call them hashtag receipts for the shit I talk about on the show. So a lot is to come. I have a lot of things to post for this episode. So thank you all for listening, guys, and have a great night or day or whatever the fuck you're doing. And yeah, we'll talk soon.